Welcome, everyone, to the 10th and final session of Awesome Ideas in Judaism. And today we're going to follow a little bit of both a similar pattern and a pattern that's a bit different from what we've done so far. Historically, my approach has been to define the idea in question and then go about explaining and expanding on the ideas that Rabbi Green brings in his book, Judaism's 10 Best Ideas. I'm still going to do that. But at the end, as opposed to trying to kind of tie this to Jewish life and practice in a meaningful way, I'd like to do a bit of an overview and summation and kind of look back over the topics we've covered so far throughout this whole course. And I have an idea of something of a through line. It should become pretty apparent. But I'm curious to get your reactions to that towards the end. And if you have feedback, actually, we were talking before we just started about feedback for this course overall. I would love to hear it. I feel like there's a good chance this gets taught in some form more than once. I think this is there's too much core Torah here to not teach this again. And so I'd love your feedback to help improve and refine this course, both I think as it pertains to the online presentation and also the content. I hope I'm not teaching this course online only forever. I would like to do it in person again too. So, and as always, of course, you're very welcome to ask questions along the way. Just looking at the length of my notes, I feel like I have a lot to say this time. So I will do my best to pause for questions and comments, but please do jump in. You can either just take yourself off mute. That'll bump you up to the top of my participants list, and I'll see that you have something to say. You can also use the raise hand feature, which you should find if you open your participants list yourself. I can't necessarily see everyone's video, so just waving at me won't necessarily work. But by all means, please jump in with whatever you have to question or whatever question you have or whatever comment you have to make. You're also welcome to respond, ask additional questions. One of the cool things about the chat box is you can kind of have parallel conversations without disrupting the flow of the shiur. So you're welcome to type whatever you like in there, and I have that up, so I'll be able to see it as well. Okay. So the 10th and final chapter of Rabbi Arthur Green's book is called Echad, and the subtitles for that: Hear, O Israel, there is only one. So he immediately connects this to what I would agree he calls the most famous prayer in Judaism, and notes that it really is not, in fact, a prayer. So I've pulled it here for you, source number one. I could have pulled this from two different places on the Sefaria engine. I could have pulled it from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, because it is a verse from Torah. I pulled it here from the Siddur, that's the prayer book. And it appears multiple times in there as well. I pulled it from the weekday morning service. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. That's how you would read that in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, Yud-He Vav-He is our God. Yud-He Vav-He is one. So this essential proclamation, Rabbi Green notes it's not a prayer. Frequently Jewish prayers have they're petitionary in some sort. They're either asking for something or they're blessing God. They involve the blessing formula, the Baruch Atah Adonai formula. Whereas this one is a proclamation. It's a message addressed to the Jewish community, to Israel, saying, Shema, literally listen, hear, right? Now, this is understood on one hand to be the basic idea of monotheism, right? Mono, one, theism, God, in contradistinction, of course, to polytheism, the idea that there are many gods. This is Shema saying there aren't many gods, there's just one. But as simple as that sounds, if you take anything away from this course, it's never as simple, never actually as clear as all that. Rabbi Green, in his chapter, asks kind of three different important questions. First, what does Echad, what does one mean? What does God mean? What does Yud-He Vav-He represent? And who is Israel? And those are kind of the three framing questions that are going to help us expand this idea of oneness. So what does Echad, that's the Hebrew numeral one. What does one even mean? Some people translate the end of this line as Yud He Vav He, God alone, such that it would read, the meaning of it would be something like, listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Does that mean other gods? I'm sorry, the Lord alone. Does that mean other gods exist, but the one God is the only one that's ours, as in God is one out of many? Could it be one in the sense of being indivisible? You know, that's an idea that religions have wrestled with. Previously, does God have more than one aspect or something along those lines? Is God unified or singular? Is that what the one means here? Is this just Israel, the people of Israel's particularistic claim? You know, is in just as any other nation sees their own religion as the true religion to the exclusion of others? Is this just Israel making that claim about the God of Israel, that yep, our God is our God, and that's the only one that we believe in? So we have to ask the essential question, which Rabbi Green asks, which is what's at stake, basically? What is the point of this claim? What's the point of monotheism? What good does it do for us? And I think if we can't answer that compellingly, then our claim that Yud He Vav He is one is subject to cultural relativism. You know, how can we say that it's objectively any more true or less true than any other idea, right? So I reproduced for you here what I think is perhaps the most important paragraph in Rabbi Green's whole book. It's I would say it's my favorite. It's the one that's most moving to me. The only value of monotheism is to make you realize that all beings, every creature, and that means the rock and the blade of grass, as well as your pet lizard and your annoying neighbor next door, are all one in origin. You come from the same place. You were created in the same great act of love, God bestowing God's own grace on every creature that would ever come to be. Therefore, and this is the key line, the only one that really counts, treat them that way. They are all God's creatures, just as you are. They exist only because of the divine presence, the same divine presence that makes you exist. Get to know them, get to love them, discover the unique divine gift within each of them, as well as the common bond of existence that draws you all together. Live in amazement at the divine light strewn throughout the world. That's what it means to be a religious human being. Even if you do not take the story of creation literally, and I, for one, do not. Seeing this amazement and wonder in all of existence is the beginning point of faith. So to sum that all up, what Rabbi Green sees as the purpose, the point of monotheism, is to make you realize that all beings, everything in the universe is somehow one in origin. And moreover, that creates an obligation, that understanding that oneness means you have to live in relationship to that. There's a therefore. You have to treat them that way, as if they're all one. If you find this idea compelling, I got to put in a plug for another one of Rabbi Green's books called Radical Judaism, also been influential upon me. There, Rabbi Green goes into depth on his perception that this oneness and awareness of that oneness creates obligation. Also, side note, in between our last class and this one, Rabbi Green published a new book, as a matter of fact. Just came out this week. It's actually, he called it an update to Radical Judaism. It's called Judaism for the World. I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to do so. So I just wanted you to know that as well. So in Rabbi Green's interpretation, this is what Shema means when it says Yud He Vav He is one. It's saying that, you know, we have an idea of how to understand one. It says this, it's this unity, this essential unity, this essential oneness of everything in the world is all essentially the same, all essentially one in what we in our language choose to call God. So we have an understanding of one, at least to work with for our purposes here. But how do we understand the subject of that sentence? How do we render God's name? So note how the Hebrew text shown here. It says Shema Yisrael, and then you get just a single letter Hey with this little, I've heard that called a chupchik in Hebrew. I have no idea why. That's just what I've heard it called. There's just a single letter Hey, Eloheinu, a single letter Hey with a triptych Echad. That letter Hey stands in for the word Hashem, literally the name. I mean, that's another name by which particularly, I'd say Jews on the more Orthodox end of the spectrum call God. They call God Hashem, just the name. And it stands in for where this verse would appear in Torah. You'd find written out 4 Hebrew letters, what is frequently called the Tetragrammaton in biblical studies. And it's conveyed here by the English translation I've chosen, Yud, He, Vav, which is usually rendered as a W. Hey, Yud, He, Vav, He is the 4-letter name that you see printed out. So printed texts tend to avoid writing out the 4 letters, as the divine name is understood to impart holiness to what it's written on. That's why, a Torah scroll, for example, or a Chumash, a Bible that's in which those 4 letters are written out. There's special care that needs to be taken with that book. Sidurs, things like that. Oh, a diacritic. Yes, a diacritic mark is definitely what that's called. Yeah, I like the Hebrew. It's more fun. Chip. Okay. So writing out the divine name is understood to impart holiness, and there's rules essentially for what you need to do with that. So if you're writing it out for something that's not going to be an object you're going to treat with respect, there's a certain allergicness to writing it out. Side note, Rabbi Green mentions that that God's name is badly mispronounced often as Jehovah. Although he doesn't go into it there. I thought I'd indulge that side note a little bit and tell you about how that came to be. You almost certainly heard of Jehovah's Witnesses or, God being referred to as Jehovah. I made a handy little chart for you here. So in the unvoweled text, this is what you'd see, Yud, He, Vav, He. However, what we say when we read aloud, like when you're chanting Torah aloud, is Adonai. So basically what happened was Christian Bible translators who knew how to read Hebrew, but didn't understand the Jewish tradition between how the Jewish tradition behind how the divine name is voweled, just took it at face value. So basically we read the Torah text out loud in synagogue on Sundays. We get to this name. It itself is not pronounceable, as we'll get to in a little while. And the Torah doesn't itself come with vowels in it. You only get the unvoweled text. That's all the little dots and dashes around. So basically, the tradition became to substitute at that point the word Adonai. It means my Lord. We'll get in, like I said, we'll talk more about why we say Adonai specifically later on. But note the vowel pattern. You get the 2 dots with a line just below the aleph, the dot above for the O, and the sort of T-shaped vowel there called the kamatz at the end. So you get A, O, A. And so what printed editions of the Bible did to remind you to say Adonai when you read there is basically take those vowels and put them under the 4 letters. Note there's a little bit of a difference here. The single line dropped out there. There's grammatical reasons why that would happen. But this was never intended to be pronounced. This was intended to be a reminder to a reader to say Adonai when you reach that word. However, Christian Bible translators who knew how to read Hebrew but didn't understand the tradition got there and read it out loud. This says Yehovah. So a pious but somewhat misguided mistake. They thought that was God's name. And so now we have Jehovah. Side note, like I said, the reality is Yud, He, Vav, He, those 4 letters are not really a name at all. You can't actually pronounce them. It's, as Rabbi Green points out, this impossible conflation of all the tenses of the verb in Hebrew to be. I'll show you a conjugation table. Yes, that breath sounds. There are many drashas on why these are the letters. Amy shares one in the chat that they're all breath sounds. Yes. From a grammatical point of view, Yud He Vav He is this sort of impossible conflation of all different tenses that hints at the verb for expresses being, that expresses existence without actually being any of them. What you're looking at now is a verb table. This is the kind of thing I dealt with in rabbinical school all the time, taken from a really excellent all-in Hebrew website that produces these tables for you. This is the conjugation table for hey yud yud, which is the root for the word to be. And I've circled the ones that are involved here. This would be he or it was, haya, is, hoveh, and these ones are actually unpronounced or unexpressed in modern Hebrew. If I wanted to say I am hungry, that takes me 3 words in English. In Hebrew, you just say ani raev, I hungry. You don't actually say these words, but in theory they exist. So hoveh and will be, yihiyeh. So you can see these are all related. There's hays and vavs and yuds all throughout. I mean, just look at the whole page. It's all hays and vavs and yuds, right? Yet it's not, the yud hey vav hey, the specific arrangements of letters appears nowhere on this page. Stephanie asks if capitalization matters. There's no such thing as capital or non-capital in Hebrew. So some of these look like they're a little bigger. I'm not totally sure why. I think they're trying to convey where the emphasis is, where the accent on the word is. So it's hayya. That's why the ya is a little bit bigger. But there's no such thing as capital or uncapital or I guess lowercase in Hebrew. So, as Rabbi Green suggests, a plausible translation would be something like trying to combine all of these at once. Was his will be. Now, of course, that's really difficult, and you could see why the substitution to Adonai was made to try to say was his will be every time. But in a way, that's could potentially be a more loyal translation of those 4 letters. So Rabbi Green and actually the Jewish mystical tradition really prefers being or existence as a translation for God. In fact, the Hebrew word for being or for existing is havaya, hey, vav, yud, hey. It's just a rearrangement of those 4 letters. Again, you see the connection in between those 4-letter name and the verb to be. So you'll hear some folks, especially who run in mystical circles, substitute havaya sometimes in place of the name of God. And we come upon this pretty profound meaning here. God and existence are not separable from one another. God is not some entity over there who created a separate, distinct entity called world. There's not 2. There's only one. God and existence are in some ways the same. And understood this way, this is what the oneness of expressed in the Shema is trying to get at. God is one. There is only one existence, right? And it embraces everything. So God in that way is coexistent with existence and is entirely one. Rabbi Green puts what I think is a pretty fine point on it. Rabbi Green says, if you say you believe in one God, but then go on to depict that God in any single way, taken literally, that's just a concentrated form of idolatry. Now, like I said, a very fine point put on it, but you could see what would provoke this, that kind of strident claim. If we're trying to claim that God is existence itself, how can we get, how can we say that God is anything like anything that exists in our world, or from our human perspective, right? How could we possibly hope to describe all of existence in any sort of word or with any metaphor? Rabbi Green specifically calls out the old guy with a beard on the throne image. And when I first read Rabbi Green in this passage, my initial reaction was take that, conservative Christians, right? God's not an old guy on a beard. You don't know how to read Hebrew, you don't understand anything about this. But after another pass, I realized that claim that old guy on a beard with a throne is a concentrated form of idolatry has real consequences for Judaism and Jewish tradition as well. We're headed into the high holiday season, in which one of our central pieces of liturgy, which has appeared in Sidurim for at least 1,000 years and has roots back 2,000-ish years, one of the key pieces of liturgy is Avinu Malkeinu, literally our Father, our King, referring to God, right? So I want to make an important clarification, lest anyone say that Rabbi Green and Rabbi Phil are accusing the High Holiday Machzor of idolatry. Father and King are metaphors, right? They express the authors, and in as much as this text has been adopted by Jewish communities, the community's human perspective that God is in some way like a father, like a king. And it's easy to me, I get it. It's easy to see how they got there. Jewish tradition has long understood God as commanding, right, through the mitzvot. One of the main things that a king, or in fact a father, does. God's been a source of feelings of comfort and protection and being looked out for, right? Another thing that a king or a father does. We've always been constrained by the limits of human language in our attempts to express what God is. So deploying metaphors is fine. It's what you can't do is believe them. You can't take them literally. And that's where Rabbi Green argues people get into trouble, people get led astray. Once you have, as Rabbi Green calls it, the aha moment, right? The realization that idolatry is folly, where does that realization take you? Rabbi Green gives an example, and perhaps I think the crucial example of how the profound meaning that we talked about, that God is the essential unity of existence itself, has been obscured. Rabbi Green first brings a great midrash, which I want to share with you in detail, where Judaism localizes that aha moment. I want to talk about the aha moment as we understand it in Judaism, and then where it takes us. So it comes from the book of Genesis, to begin with, and actually a midrash on this portion. So this, what I'm showing you on your screens right now, is the very end of chapter 11 of Genesis, and the very first verse beginning chapter 12. So the character of Abraham, who's here called Avram, this is pre-name change that he undergoes later. So Avram's introduced as one of the sons of Terach in this genealogical list of descendants from Shem. Shem was one of Noah's 3 sons. Noah previously had a connection all the way back to Adam HaRishon, the first human. That list is in chapter 5. So we learn at some point here, Terach took his son Avram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, who was already married to Avram. They set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans for the land of Canaan. But when they'd come as far as Haran, they settled there. And the days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. I strongly encourage you not to take the years here with an undue amount of seriousness. Okay. So we learned that Terach took his family, including Abraham and Avram and Sarai, from Ur. They would have been going up and around the Fertile Crescent from what is today, from what was then Babylonia, present-day Iraq, up around the Fertile Crescent, and they made it as far as a place called Haran. Haran is both a place and a person here. I know it's confusing. Both a person and a city. But that's all we know about Avram. Then at the beginning of chapter 12, the Lord, and again you can see printed out here, Yud He Vav He with those vowels we talked about. God said to Avram, Lech Lecha, go forth from your native land, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. So it's like, boom, all of a sudden God's talking to Avram. And not only that, giving him the command that'll become the starting point for the development of the entire nation of Israel. Right? This is the starting point for like our whole story. There's a lot that seems like it needs to go in that gap in between here, right? Like there's a lot of detail missing. This is one of the main things that Midrash is for, and I like to say Midrash is stories about stories in the Tanakh. Midrash comes and fills in this gap. We have questions, right? We want to know what happened in between. How did we get here? How did we get to the point from, what happened in Avram's childhood that led him to this point where he's, now in conversation with God. So the Midrash comes, and we read it here in Bereshit Rabbah, fills in this gap, basically. and it's a great story. This story is actually, I've heard, so well known. A lot of times people think it's in the Bible itself, even though it is in fact just a midrash. Rabbi Chia taught Terach, who was Avram's father, was a manufacturer of idols. He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell them in his place. A man came in and wished to buy one. How old are you? Avram asked the man. 50 years old, he said. Woe to such a man who is 50 years old and would worship a day-old object. He's already got an acerbic wit, right? On another occasion, a woman came in with a plate full of flour and requested of him, take this and offer it to them. So Avram took a stick and broke them, meaning the idols, broke the idols and put the stick in the hand of the largest. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? I cannot conceal it from you, Avram said. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One of the idols claimed, I must eat first, while another claimed, I must eat first. Thereupon the largest one arose, took the stick and broke them. Why do you make sport of me? Have they any knowledge? Terach said. Abraham replies, should not your ears hear what your mouth has said? Don't you know, like you just said yourself, these are nothing but stone idols, but here you are worshiping them like gods, right? So in Jewish literary tradition, this is the aha moment, right? This is the moment where Avram figures it out for himself that all this idol stuff is nonsense. Really, there's just one God of the universe, right? Okay, cool. Now the story can play out in a meaningful way. We understand ourselves now to be spiritual descendants of the guy who first had the aha moment. And everything centers around the one God of Israel. You know, the Torah is called the 5 books of Moses, but I think we could probably agree the main character really throughout has to be God, right? God's on like every page. Once we start reading Torah out loud, well over 2,000 years ago, we had to figure out how to get around the, at that time, already known tradition of not pronouncing God's name. This connects to, so I told you we'd get back to why we say Adonai in place of the 4 letters, right? There was already tradition well known at that point that we don't pronounce that out loud. Where that comes from is in the past further than anyone can record, but the Mishnah, which you'll recall is from about the late 2nd, early 3rd century CE, the Common Era. The Mishnah here in Yoma knows a tradition that as part of the Yom Kippur ritual, the high priest would place his hands on a specially designated goat, which is actually, this is where we get the term scapegoat. The priest would place his hands on the goat and symbolically translate it to transfer to the goat all of Israel's sins and all of Israel's transgressions. They would send that goat away, and in that way, all the sort of accumulated sin gunk over the course of the year would be purged from the community. Okay. As part of that ritual, the priest would actually pronounce what it calls here the explicit name of God, in which the Mishnah records here as having had the power to produce such overwhelming awe that everyone who heard it would fall down, would bend their knees, bow down, and fall on their faces and say, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. That sounds familiar. That's what the Siddur has us say right after we say Shema. When we recite Shema as part of the service, we say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and then frequently quietly under our breath, because it comes from the Mishnah and not from the Torah, we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed before continuing on with Ve'ahavta and the other Bible verses. Nice connection, right? So we obviously can't be having this happen multiple times per page, right? Everyone hearing the divine name of God, bowing down, the readings would take forever. In any case, the pronunciation tradition was already understood, but even by the period of the Mishnah, to have been lost. We no longer, even by the rabbis of the Mishnah, no longer knew how to properly say the explicit name of God. So the tradition became substitution. We substitute Adonai, which I said means my Lord, every time you read the divine name. As Rabbi Green notes, this is a well-meaning act of piety, right? By setting up God as a Lord, it's a way of saying, I'm your servant. God is my Lord. Like Bob Dylan saying, you're gonna have to serve somebody, right? So it's not a bad idea. It's a good thing, I think, and Rabbi Green says this explicitly. It's a good thing to be a servant of being, a servant of existence itself. Rabbi Green's words, it means to treat all of existence with respect, to show a combination of love and reverence to each creature, to be a conveyor of universal compassion. But people heard Lord, began to picture an earthly Lord. We know lords and ladies and nobles from all throughout history, and began picturing that earthly Lord, which is where we start to get the bearded white guy on a throne. And this essentially became a distraction, right? Away from understanding God as existence itself to understanding God as some kind of, personified noble figure. Amy says, I've read about Aleph Daled Nun, as in Adon. I've read the word can be understood as foundation, suggesting this name points us to our foundation. It's possible. I don't know. I'd have to look up in a dictionary about that. Adon is usually how that's how you say Mr. in modern Hebrew. I would be, someone who didn't know my title rabbi would call me Adon Bressler, like Mr. Bressler. In addition, the word shares a root with Aden. That's true. Spiritual foundation without separation. Very good. Okay. Let me take a pause there. Stephanie asked, what dictionary would ideally use to look up? This is a question of style. Different teachers in my Beit Midrash had different opinions about which dictionary was the best. I would say for something like, it depends where you're looking. If you're looking up Hebrew from the Bible, you're looking up biblical Hebrew, you're going to want a biblical Hebrew dictionary. The one put out by Jastro, I think it's called a Lexicon of the Hebrew, I can't remember what the title is. We just call it Jastro. That has both biblical Hebrew and Aramaic in it. There's another one that people really like. The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, what everyone calls BDB, is good for specifically biblical Hebrew, but not Mishnaic Hebrew. So the answer is it kind of depends. Depends so it depends on what your purpose and which era of Hebrew you're looking up for. So it's not so much, yes, for you. There are multiple options for each of those eras. Hebrew has changed a lot between Hebrew of the Bible, Hebrew of the Rabbinic period, and Hebrew of today. So the question is, what text are you reading? Okay, so let me take a pause for questions, comments, things so far before we go any further. Have you followed some of the linguistic stuff going on? Any other questions or comments? You guys are active in the chat, which I appreciate. Okay, good. Please speak up. I'm gonna keep going so I cover everything I plan. All right. So Rabbi Green claims, and I think I agree, people have been pretty distracted by some of the metaphorical language that's been deployed to describe God. And I have to reiterate here, I don't think that whoever composed Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, that the Talmud says has Rabbi Akiva, who lived in about the 2nd century, saying those words, Avinu Malkeinu, for the first time. I don't think they're an idolater. I can't say what was in their heart when they deployed that metaphor to describe their relationship to God. I like to think they understood themselves as being a servant of being. But what I can say is, boy, did people really take the bearded white guy thing and run with it. And to be clear, it's not just Jews. I mean, look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Bearded white guy representing God, touching fingers with another white guy. Okay, so the Siddur, the prayer book, which is the primary exposure that Jews have to Jewish theological ideas, for better or for worse, is rife with this kingship metaphor, right? Many other examples of the word malchut, kingship, God will rule and be sovereign and all these kind of things. We hear that language, that metaphorical language, deployed throughout our liturgy. And for the most part, throughout human history, this was like the loftiest understanding of status that could be achieved by anyone. It's as far towards describing God as our language could carry us, I think. But the key, which Rabbi Green preaches against, is to avoid confusing the metaphor with what it actually represents. So in this way, spelling out that four-letter incomprehensible name, which seems to be hinting at being or existence itself, while also simultaneously not actually being a word that says that, simultaneously acknowledging that, even being or existence itself, doesn't quite cut it. I think there's a lot of ways in which that's preferable. So we've talked about, one, understanding God as the essential unity of existence, the essential divine presence throughout everything in the universe that makes it all somehow one. We've talked about God, how we can understand Yud-He Vav-He in a way as being literally existence itself, that the force that makes for existence, right? As we go to try to tie this all together, both our idea of Echad within this session and throughout this course, we got to ask, who is Israel? Who is Yisrael in the Shema? So the word comes from the story also in Genesis of Jacob wrestling all night with some kind of angelic messenger, some kind of malach. Usually gets rendered as angel. Without going into ideas of angelology, it's some sort of divine messenger, some sort of symbol of divinity, come to earth to interact with people. Jacob is on his way to encounter his brother Esau, meets this angel, and wrestles with the angel all night. The angel couldn't beat him, and neither could Jacob get the upper hand. The dawn was about to rise. The angel says, "You need to let me go. I need to go, and like I do every morning, go to heaven with all the other angels, sing praises to God." So Jacob got the angel to agree to bless him, and in the process earned himself a new name. He would no longer be known as Yaakov. He'd also be known as Yisrael, which if we break it apart, Yisra means to wrestle or struggle with, El, a name for God. So Yisrael literally means wrestle, struggle with God. Jacob, another one of our spiritual ancestors, right? Just like in the line of descent from Abraham, we all, in some way, as Jews, understand ourselves as being God wrestlers. So Rabbi Green points out that everyone who struggles to make sense out of life is, in part of some broader community called Israel. There's Israel, the historical Jewish people. There's now a state of Israel, which includes not just Jews, but also Muslims, Christians, people of all faiths and backgrounds. There's also another Israel. It's a bit of an undefined nation. It's the community of seekers, people who seek and struggle. The subtitle for Rabbi Green's book, A Brief Guide for Seekers, right? It makes sense. Jessica was saying earlier that a Catholic friend with whom she shared some of this sees a lot of what they believe in it, right? There's a sense that we're all wrestling in some way. We're all struggling. We're all seeking. So looking back over the 10 ideas that Rabbi Green has, and I got to give Rabbi Green credit for some chutzpah here to call them Judaism's best ideas. This is part of what I see as a unifying thread. And this is where I would open it to you too, to look back. I've listed the 10 chapter titles, which have also been our session titles here for you. This is part of what I see as a unifying thread. And I'm curious if you see anything else in common here too. I think they're all in some way connected to the struggle to make sense out of life, right? If what we're wrestling with is God and God is existence itself, then we're wrestling with the predicament of just existing. What does it all mean? What are we supposed to do? So I'm curious. I kind of want to go one at a time, because I kind of want to see if this pans out, and if you buy it or not. So I'm going to go one at a time. I'll tell you what I think what the struggle might be, and you weigh in with any other ideas. So back in our first session, we talked about simcha, which literally means joy. It's the idea of happiness as a religious precept, that at some level, God wants us to be happy, right? I think we see here the struggle is with not only sadness, but meaninglessness, hopelessness, something like that, right? There's a way that sadness, hopelessness sort of encroaches on us and needs to be wrestled with and fended off. And simcha as a religious precept is part of that struggle. It's how we go about that wrestling in an organized way, by making our life cycle events simchas, making them joyous occasions, by marking out time and setting up waypoints along through a person's life and through our individual journeys as moments of happiness, to keep that sadness and meaninglessness at bay. John asks, is there an order to this list? Is Rabbi Green prioritizing? That is a valid question, and I don't know. He doesn't say in the book, like David Letterman's list of 10. That is a good question. One thing that's really amazing about Rabbi Arthur Green, you can just email him and he'll respond to you. My dad one time asked, can I email Rabbi Green? I'm like, yeah, you can just email him. I went and asked, and Rabbi Green was like, sure. You can track him down. I think through the Hebrew College website. He's almost certainly something like agreen@hebrewcollege.edu. But if you want to ask that question, send him an email. By all means, if I ever get in another shiur with him, I'll ask on your behalf, John, and find out. My guess is no. I think there's a reason Echad comes at the end, but my sense is not necessarily. But if you see one, I would love to hear it. In any case, the second item, Tselem Elohim, the idea that human beings are created in God's image. Rabbi Green's subtitle is, what are we doing here? And so I think that really betrays what the struggle is. It's a struggle to understand our purpose, our mission. Like, what is the point of us? There's a way that without an understanding of purpose or mission, this all doesn't mean anything. Nothing. It's hard to feel like you have any sort of solid ground to stand on, to feel like anything you do makes sense or means anything. And I think that's the kind of technology that Judaism has brought to bear. The idea of creation in God's image helps define our purpose, helps define our mission. And also, as we discussed in that session, has all these other ramifications throughout Jewish life and practice in terms of the value we place on Jewish life, on human life. And how that helps us order our priorities. Actually, that dawns on me here too. If I'm going back through these notes, I think that the struggle is with purpose and mission, but also perhaps with priorities. How do we decide which are the most important actions to take? Well, one of the answers to that is the ones that prioritize life, right? Because of this idea, this groundedness in Tselem Elohim. Again, if you have anything to add or comment, please jump in. The third one, halakha. So this is halakha, you'll recall, means a path. It's a path that you walk through. Oh, Amy, sorry, were you going to say something about Tselem Elohim?
Well, I was just going to say, this might sound like I'm being flip at first, but I'm not, that the meaning of life is that it ends. Right. And that could be a very depressing thought, or just overwhelming. So I think it's quite meaningful that the first thing he presents is joy.
Indeed, especially given that number 9, before sort of the culminating Echad, is l'chaim. It's about to life. Yeah, I flagged that one as struggling with making sense out of of death, with the fact that life ends. Yeah, absolutely.
And, number two, being made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing here? After you get a sense that there can be joy, even though, or there should be joy, even though things are very time limited.
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing here is the larger question. And then 3 through 8 definitely gives you steps to walk that path.
Yeah.
Be able to have some structure and open to joy and everything else.
I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of trying to discern the organizational structure here.
And maybe as we get, further on in our life and even closer to our death, the oneness of everything becomes more important to think about and to sense, because our time is more limited here. But if there's a sense of a unitive force that is beyond this one, it can bring some ease.
Yeah, I think I would say yes, and people tend to think about the really big questions when they confront mortality, but the importance is actually, I think more ideally we'd be thinking about it all the time, every day, all the time. But it's the wrestle, the encounter with mortality that frequently prompts us to actually do that work. It's hard to do. Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie, please, you have your hand raised. You can take yourself off mute.
Hey, I'm going to send the question that I had via text and then update it by voice if you're able to hear me. If this is an actual problem, please let me know, because I have actually Beethoven playing in a different
No, go ahead. You're good.
My dog. So, okay. This really resonates with me because I spend a lot of time thinking about big questions. I'm a philosopher who spends a lot of time with existential philosophy. Because I'm currently writing an academic paper about Levinas. And so the comment about the meaning of life coming from its end has really important professional, right, like philosophical questions that I think that everybody can connect to, because the kind of philosophy that we're talking about are the questions that everybody's dealing with, and also personal, because I'm having to, just like everybody, making very difficult decisions about end of life care for everyone I love, because it's a global pandemic and that's what we're doing. And I just wanted to chime in that the comment was that these big questions can be depressing. And one of the things that I have learned through my teaching and research and personal experience is that it might be at first, and in fact it might be traumatizing, so much so that when I talk about this stuff, I just think everything in the world needs a content warning right now, because you can't tell what is going through by just looking at them.
Absolutely.
But you can't tell from the sound of their voice or what they're doing with their body mind, because they might have a disability that you don't understand. And that's actually why I have my video off right now, just because I'm not feeling well, and this is how I'm able to show up right now.
That's okay.
So I apologize if I'm monopolizing the time. Really, all I want to say is that my name is Stephanie. Yep. And there was a question about who is speaking, and this is so valuable to me right now, and I really appreciate that I'm a noob.
That's all right. Well, I can. You're absolutely within your right, and it's a privilege of being on Zoom to be able to toggle your camera on and off as you see fit.
Okay.
And
the last thing I want to say, and then I want to recognize that I don't understand the cultural norms, and I'm just going to turn my audio off, which is good. You're good. The most important thing that I have learned from my life, and that's a work in a life project, and now your class, so thank you.
Of course.
Is that God wants us to be happy.
So far, so good.
And we might not understand why we are having to deal with this level of personal and collective trauma together, but that it is that death is the finitude of existence is where we find meaning and our priorities and freedom and purpose and and how you define those things depends on who your philosophical reference is. And this is so important to me that my references are Martin Heidegger, who I think you all know for his very poor ethical political choices during a relevant historical time point. So I got so mad that I burned a Heidegger book, right? And I'm going to stop. I just want to say thank you. Yeah.
Good. No, so you're doing great. You're asking the questions that are worth asking, and what I think that each one of these ideas has a whole expansion all throughout Jewish literature, Jewish culture, and Jewish thought, and you've hit on some of the big questions. For our limited purpose here, I think we're looking at the connection between the two. I think we're starting to identify, I think, an interesting structure to the way this is arranged, that both, creation in the divine image, which gives a sense of purpose from the outset is set at the beginning in Rabbi Green's scheme, and the struggle with death, the struggle with the sense of mortality is towards the end. They both serve actually to wrestle with the sense of purpose, right? Absolutely. Stephanie Jorgensen, you're off of mute. You want to say something, please?
I guess I found that perhaps being at the age I am, there is a looking back and sort of having things all blend into, with life experiences, blend into understanding a lot of things of what Rabbi Green is saying. The relationship to all of the different things and how they come together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think. I'm curious too, Stephanie, if you identify another kind of through line through all of these. The one that's resonating for me is the sort of idea of if they're all representative of a struggle of one kind or another. You talked about sort of tying it all together, which is, I think, exactly what we're doing right now. So if you have more to say, please.
Yeah, well, no, it was just, of course, you were familiar with what's going on inside of me anyway,
sure.
In terms of wrestling. I love when I got to that discussion of Israel and wrestling, and I was thinking, oh boy, have I been wrestling?
Yeah, I mean there's a reason I think Rabbi Green ends there, is because that's what it's all about. That's I think one of the key self-understandings that Jews have had of themselves, and I think of Rabbi Green is arguing that actually applies to anyone who understands themselves as a seeker. The idea that these are not simple questions with cut and dried answers, that our best attempts at answers, some of what Rabbi Green lays out, really just help us frame the question, right? Let's see. I'm curious if my idea holds up. Halakha, walking the path, a community of doers. The idea that there is a struggle with finding our own personal path, but also figuring out what's right in a broader sense, what's right for us, and at a communal level as well, struggling with what's right for a community to do. Halakha has both personal and communal dimensions, which we talked about in that class. As I think as Amy noted, there's this sort of expansion here where I think after we introduce the idea of halakha, Tikkun Olam, Shabbat, Tshuva, Torah, and maybe Talmud Torah sort of all fall under that rubric. Like they all seem to launch from the point of halakha to me. Tikkun Olam, struggle with perhaps a world that appears broken, or wrestling with the brokenness that appears to exist in the world. Shabbat maybe something like struggle with the grind, with sort of undifferentiated time, struggle to create holiness in time, perhaps. And in that way, as we've talked about, create meaning in time. Tshuva, struggle with making mistakes, straying off the path, something along those lines. Torah, in the sense of struggling with tradition, making sense out of guidance that's been passed to us from previous generations. And then Talmud Torah, struggling with how do we locate ourselves within, that continuity of that community of God wrestlers over generations. How do we both learn from the guidance of past generations and pass it on to the next? We've talked about l'chaim, something like struggle with sense of death, mortality. Again, with struggle with the meaning of life, but kind of from the other end of it. And Echad, struggle to understand and live into really the only idea worth understanding. I think in some ways that it's all one. It's all one. Let's see. Amy says, seems to me our purpose is not to be happy, a transient feeling, but to be a co-creator. We're given a structure to do the right things to promote this. We're given a structure to do the right things to promote this in the most godly direction. Yeah, I think for my part, I've defined the purpose as coming from Tselem Elohim, from the creation in the divine image, is what gives what serves to give. I guess I understand simcha, at least within this framework, as not being so much the purpose providing, but as being I suppose something parallel to that. As long as you're discovering your purpose, and figuring out what humans are for, to live into repair of the brokenness in the world and a perfection of it. Sort of concomitant with that is a desire for happiness. Not that happiness is the goal. Does that kind of make sense? At least that's how I've been understanding it. So. And yeah, in the sense of being a structure to do things to promote this in the most godly direction. Yeah, that's the idea of halakha is a complex one. There are a lot of conceptions these days about what how halakha works and what it means. There's frameworks that were understood as being normative for many generations that now are being questioned and reconstructed in a lot of interesting ways. Rachel said, I want to point out that while simcha is not the purpose, yes, Judaism differs from some other religions that it encourages joy and believes joy is attainable in this world. Life is not meant to be a vale of tears. Yeah, I think that's an excellent summation of Rabbi Green's chapter on simcha. There's a way that the world just makes us sad. I think pretty obviously tied into some of these other ideas. Mortality, brokenness in the world, and one of the messages, not necessarily the purpose, is to struggle with that, struggle against that, and struggle towards joy, as much as possible. Good. Well, friends, this has been an absolute blast of a class to teach. I got to tell you, this has involved. From my standpoint, getting to go back over a text that's been important to me, re-encounter a teacher who's been really influential on me, explore in some ways how I relate to some of these essential questions, and kind of take what was previously kind of amorphously understood but not really explicitly expressible. You've kind of forced me by having me teach this class to take what I think and get it out in a comprehensible way. And that's had a noticeable settling effect on me, I think. And that I feel like I understand myself a little bit better for having prepared to teach. And also through the encounter with you, those who have been students in this whole process. As I've said already before, you're also my teachers. Everything that you do and ask and say, I learn from as well. Thank you so much for bringing your full selves to this, and for engaging with these challenging and I think deeply interesting ideas. I hope this has been both edifying and affirming for you. I hope you've both encountered something useful and something challenging. And I hope that this serves as a bit of a platform for further study. I think, as I said, each one of these could be their own course only on any of these ideas. So I hope that what you're able to do is take these ideas and see how they're interwoven throughout all other parts of Jewish life and Jewish learning and Jewish practice.